The greatest empires in history were sometimes built with wedding rings, not swords. This is the story of the Shadow Empire, a hidden web of power woven through strategic royal marriages. We are taught to see history as a saga of conquests and battles, but the most lasting shifts in power often happened quietly, sealed with a kiss and a binding contract. By the end of this journey, you will see the map of Europe not as a patchwork of nations, but as a single, sprawling family tree where bloodlines were the ultimate currency. How did a single vow at an altar redirect the flow of gold and soldiers across continents? What was the human cost of turning princesses into peace treaties? We are about to trace the invisible architecture of control that dynasties like the Habsburgs used to dominate the world without firing a single arrow. What does true power look like when it wears the gentle mask of diplomacy? That delicate web, glistening with morning dew, is a perfect metaphor for the power we are about to uncover. It has no great walls or standing armies you can point to on a map. Its strength lies entirely in its connections, in the subtle tension of threads that link one distant point to another. This is the Shadow Empire. While traditional kingdoms were defined by the land they physically controlled, marked by fortresses and guarded borders, a shadow empire was something far more fluid and far more enduring. It was an architecture of influence built on obligations and, most crucially, shared blood. Think of it this way: a king who conquers a province must station troops there, impose his laws, and constantly guard against rebellion. It is expensive, messy, and unstable, but a king whose daughter marries the ruler of that same province, he gains a son-in-law, a future grandchild who may one day inherit that land, and a binding alliance that ties its fortunes to his own. No soldiers needed to march in, just a priest and a pair of wedding rings. The territory remains officially independent, but its destiny is now interwoven with a distant crown. This is the chess game historian Barbara Tuchman spoke of, where kings and queens were the pieces, and the entire board of Europe was the prize. Each strategic marriage was a move that projected power across the map without ever drawing a sword. The goal was not merely to acquire land, but to acquire legitimacy, to weave your family's story so deeply into the fabric of other realms that separating them became impossible. This subtle, pervasive form of control, this network of familial loyalty, is what allowed dynasties to build fortunes and command armies that, on paper, they did not own. Before we see the master players of this game in action, we must first understand the board itself and why a signed marriage contract often held more lasting power than a treaty written after a war. A royal wedding in the year 1496 was a spectacle of silk and gold, but the real treasure exchanged was not in the dowry chests, it was peace. For decades, the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal had been fierce rivals, racing down the coasts of Africa and arguing over newly discovered lands across the ocean. The solution their monarchs chose was not another naval battle. It was a marriage between Princess Isabella of Aragon and Prince Afonso of Portugal. With a single vow, two competing crowns were suddenly tied together by blood. This is the first and most powerful principle of the Shadow Empire. A royal marriage was not a romantic affair. It was a peace treaty wearing a wedding gown. It could halt generations of conflict in an instant, transforming a hostile neighbor into a father-in-law, a rival king into a brother-in-law. The shared family that resulted created a powerful incentive for stability. After all, you are far less likely to attack a kingdom your own grandchild is destined to rule. But these unions were far more than just symbolic gestures of goodwill. The public ceremony was merely the ratification of a meticulously detailed contract, negotiated for months by teams of diplomats. These marriage treaties spelled out everything. They promised mutual military aid if either signatory was attacked. They laid out new trade rights, opening ports and granting merchants safe passage. They defined borders and succession plans, ensuring that any children from the union would inherit specific titles and lands. The bride and groom, often teenagers, became the living, breathing seals on this formidable legal document. Their personal happiness was secondary. Their union was the glue meant to hold a fragile international order together. This practice turned the sprawling family trees of Europe's nobility into the very bedrock of diplomacy. A web of cousins, uncles, and in-laws could deter aggression more effectively than a line of fortresses. Why risk a costly war with a nation when its queen is your sister and its future king your nephew? The family network became an early warning system, a council of advisors, and a guarantee of support. It proved that a strategic dynastic union could often achieve what armies could not, a durable, if sometimes tense, peace. And the masters of this delicate, high-stakes art of familial diplomacy were waiting in the wings, ready to weave the most extensive shadow empire the world had ever seen. While the wedding vows were exchanged by princes and princesses, the real architects of these unions were seldom in the chapel. They worked in candle-lit chambers, surrounded by maps and genealogical charts. Their tools were not swords but ledgers and letters of introduction. This brings us to the second principle of the Shadow Empire. Behind every strategic royal marriage stood a hidden network of matchmakers, the diplomatic advisors who turned romance into realpolitik. These were not mere party planners. They were the geopolitical strategists of their age, a council of shrewd minds whose primary duty was to analyze, negotiate, and optimize the royal bloodline itself. At the glittering court of Burgundy in the 15th century, for example, a duke's advisors would assess a potential bride with the cold precision of modern analysts. They compiled detailed dossiers that went far beyond her family name. They calculated the exact value of her dowry, of course, but they also evaluated the strategic ports her lineage controlled, the dormant legal claims to foreign thrones she might resurrect, and even the fertility and general health of her female relatives. A princess was not just a person. She was a portfolio of assets, a bundle of treaties and territories wrapped in silk. The goal was always to strengthen the dynasty's genetic and political capital, securing its future for generations to come. Perhaps the most famous of these royal fixers was Cardinal Thomas Wolsey in the court of England's King Henry VIII. For years, Wolsey worked tirelessly as the king's chief minister, using his vast network of contacts across Europe to broker a marriage that would make England a central power on the continent. His negotiations were a masterclass in diplomatic pressure and promise, all aimed at elevating his king's status through a single, brilliant marital alliance. These advisors embodied the fox-like cunning that the philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli said every ruler needed. They could spot a fleeting opportunity in a distant court's misfortune, or weave a complex web of promises that made a seemingly undesirable match appear essential. They were the ones who understood that a wedding was not an end, but the beginning of a decades-long political calculation, and their most delicate, most high-stakes work involved the ultimate prize, not just marrying into a powerful family, but engineering a scenario where your own bloodline could peacefully inherit an entire rival kingdom without a drop of blood being shed. The ultimate goal of every dynastic matchmaker was not just an alliance but a merger. This leads us to the third and most transformative principle of the Shadow Empire. The most powerful outcome of a strategic marriage was the personal union, the breathtaking moment when two or more separate crowns came to rest upon a single head through nothing more than the silent, relentless machinery of inheritance. No war was declared, no cities were besieged. A king or queen simply woke up one day ruling a realm they were not born to rule because a great-grandparent had signed a marriage contract a century before. The rules that governed this quiet conquest were not written on battlefields but in dusty legal texts. Primogeniture ensured the firstborn son inherited everything, keeping lands unified. Salic law, used in places like France, barred women from inheriting the throne itself, but not the lands and titles they could bring to a husband. Cognatic inheritance allowed claims to pass through both male and female lines. These were the complex, often contradictory algorithms of royal blood, and dynastic advisors studied them like master codebreakers. A perfectly placed marriage could insert your family's name into a foreign line of succession, creating a legal claim that slept like a seed in winter, waiting for the right conditions to sprout into an empire. The year 1519 provides the most spectacular example in European history. A young man named Charles, who had grown up in the Netherlands, received a series of messages that would forever alter the map of the world. Through a staggering cascade of inheritances, he suddenly found himself the ruler of a collection of territories so vast and scattered it was said the sun never set upon them. He was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. His power was not the result of his own conquests, but the final, magnificent payout of generations of meticulous marital investments. From his father, Philip the Fair of Burgundy, he inherited the wealthy Low Countries and claims to various duchies. From his mother, Joanna of Castile, he inherited the unified crowns of Castile and Aragon, which brought with them the emerging empires of Spanish America. From his grandfather, Emperor Maximilian I, he inherited the Habsburg lands in Austria and the title of Holy Roman Emperor, a patchwork of hundreds of German states. This colossal inheritance was the jackpot of marital politics, a prize won because his ancestors had consistently married into the right families at the right time. His empire was a shadow empire made flesh, a personal union of crowns held together by the single thread of his own genealogy. It proved that with enough patience and precise biological engineering, a dynasty could turn the chance events of births and deaths into a predetermined geopolitical destiny. And no family understood this patient, relentless game of thrones better than the one whose name became synonymous with it, the architects of the most extensive shadow empire ever woven. The phrase that would define their dynasty was not a battle cry but a quiet, confident instruction. Bella gerent alii tu Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. This unofficial Habsburg motto was more than a clever saying. It was the operational blueprint for building a shadow empire. While rival powers like France and the Ottoman Empire drained their treasuries and manpower in endless campaigns, the Habsburgs pursued a different kind of warfare. Their battlefield was the royal chapel, their weapon of choice was the wedding ring, and their strategy was patience, playing a game that unfolded not over years but over centuries. It began with a family of relatively modest means ruling the Archduchy of Austria from Vienna. They had no vast armies to rival the French, nor the naval reach of the Spanish. What they possessed was a singular, unwavering focus on the long game of genealogy. Their ambition was not to conquer neighbors outright, but to become their heirs. Every marriage they arranged was a calculated move on a continental chessboard, with their own sons and daughters as the most valuable pieces. A single generation could see astonishing progress. A pivotal match came in 1477, when Archduke Maximilian married Mary, the sole heir to the vast and incredibly wealthy Duchy of Burgundy. This union did not just bring an alliance, it delivered the entire Burgundian inheritance, including the commercially vital Low Countries, directly into Habsburg hands. It was a masterstroke funded by nothing more than a signature and a ceremony. Maximilian then arranged for his son, Philip the Fair, to marry Joanna, the daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. That marriage planted the Habsburg seed directly into the line of succession for a unified Spain. Their grandson, as we saw, would become Charles V, the ruler of that unprecedented global empire. But the marital strategy did not stop there. Later, a carefully negotiated marriage would bring the Kingdom of Bohemia and the crowns of Hungary into the family fold, pushing Habsburg influence deep into Eastern Europe. Each new territory acquired this way came with its own armies, its own revenues, and its own legitimacy, all without the instability and resentment that followed a military conquest. The Habsburgs demonstrated on a grand historical scale that the pen and the marriage contract could assemble a dominion far greater than the sword ever could. But this elegant strategy came with a hidden and deeply human cost. For the princes and princesses whose lives were the currency of this grand design, the reality was often one of profound isolation and quiet sacrifice. The year 1496 witnessed a union that would silently reroute the destiny of continents. In the bustling Flemish city of Lille, Philip, the young Habsburg archduke known for his charm and good looks, stood beside Joanna, the infanta of a newly unified Spain. To the cheering crowds, it was a magnificent spectacle, a merging of two of Europe's most promising dynasties. But the architects of this match, Joanna's parents, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, saw far beyond the pageantry. Their calculation was breathtaking in its ambition. They had just completed the centuries-long Reconquista, reclaiming the Iberian Peninsula, and were pouring the wealth of newly discovered lands across the ocean into their royal coffers. Spain was ascending, but its future was precarious, resting on the fragile health of their children. A strategic marital alliance was their chosen method of securing that future on the global stage. By binding their daughter to the House of Habsburg, they were not just gaining an ally, they were purchasing an insurance policy written in blood, linking Spain's explosive new power to the established, patient network of Austrian influence. The dowry was immense, but the real treasure exchanged was a genetic claim to the Spanish throne for the Habsburg line. For Joanna, however, this political masterstroke unfolded as a profound personal tragedy. Historical accounts suggest she developed a deep, obsessive affection for Philip, whose frequent absences and reported indifference caused her immense distress. Over time, her behavior, likely a severe and misunderstood mental illness, led contemporaries to label her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Her story is a stark reminder of the human weight borne by these royal pawns. While diplomats celebrated the flawless execution of their treaty, a young woman grappled with isolation and a mind in turmoil, her suffering deemed irrelevant to the grand political design. The machinery of dynastic ambition ground forward, utterly indifferent to the quiet crisis of the individual at its heart. And yet, from a purely geopolitical perspective, the marriage performed exactly as intended. When Joanna's older siblings passed away without heirs, the path to the Spanish throne led directly to her. Upon her mother's death, Joanna was proclaimed Queen of Castile, with Philip as her consort. Though Philip's own early death and Joanna's health challenges led to a regency, the succession was irrevocably set. Their son, Charles, inherited everything. From his Habsburg grandfather, he received the Austrian lands and the Holy Roman Empire. From his mother, Joanna of Castile, he received the unified crowns of Spain and all its burgeoning overseas territories. The gold and silver of the Americas now flowed into Habsburg coffers. The armies of Spain now marched under a Habsburg banner. The single, calculated marriage of 1496 had successfully grafted the vast, wealthy limb of the Spanish Empire onto the ancient Habsburg family tree. It was the ultimate validation of their marital strategy, a transfer of global power so complete it made the Habsburgs the undisputed masters of Europe, all achieved without a single declaration of war. This chilling efficiency reveals the core paradox of the Shadow Empire. Its greatest triumphs were often built upon quiet, personal tragedies, a trade where the happiness of a few was willingly exchanged for the dominion of many. And as this dominion grew, the family tree itself began to twist inward, creating a web of power so tightly woven it threatened to unravel from within. The Shadow Empire was not a secret confined to the castles of Europe. Its principles were understood and mastered in courts thousands of miles away, where the air smelled of incense and the walls were adorned with different scripts. In the great city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, emperors faced a constant, terrifying pressure. Their magnificent capital was a jewel, but it was surrounded by enemies on all sides, from the Normans in the west to the nomadic tribes pressing from the north. Raising armies for every frontier was impossible, so they turned to a more elegant solution. When Emperor John II Komnenos sought to secure his volatile Danube border in the 12th century, he did not send a legion. He sent his daughter Maria. Her marriage to the heir of the Kingdom of Hungary transformed a potential adversary into a kin. It created a buffer zone of familial obligation, a living shield made of shared grandchildren. For the Byzantines, a princess was a diplomat in residence, a permanent ambassador whose very presence in a foreign court could tilt policy in favor of her homeland for a generation. This logic of binding through blood transcended religion and culture. Across the Islamic world, where polygamous practices allowed for a different kind of marital strategy, unions were equally calculated. Powerful clans and rising dynasties cemented alliances through marriage, weaving networks of loyalty that could elevate a regional power into a sultanate. The early Ottoman rulers, for instance, frequently married daughters of neighboring Turkish beyliks or chieftains to absorb their warriors and lands peacefully. A wedding could turn a rival's cavalry into your own vanguard, but perhaps the most brilliant practitioner of this art in the East was the Mughal Emperor Akbar, who ruled India in the 16th century. He faced the monumental task of governing a vast, diverse subcontinent where his Muslim faith was a minority. His solution was a series of strategic marriages to Hindu Rajput princesses. These were not acts of conquest but of integration. By marrying into the most powerful warrior clans of Rajasthan, Akbar did not just secure a non-aggression pact. He made their leaders his family, his most trusted generals and administrators. He transformed potential rebels into fathers-in-law and uncles to the future emperor. This web of marital alliances granted his empire a stability and legitimacy that sheer military force alone could never have achieved. From the golden halls of Constantinople to the marble palaces of Agra, the pattern is unmistakable. The use of marriage as a primary tool of statecraft was a near-universal principle of pre-modern governance. It was a global strategy, a fundamental human insight into how power could be woven rather than seized. Whether the ceremony was in a cathedral, a mosque, or a temple, the outcome was the same: the quiet construction of a shadow empire built on kinship. This reveals something profound about power itself. When resources are limited and communication is slow, the most durable bonds are not written on parchment, but encoded in blood. It is a reminder that the architecture of influence is often built with the softest materials, with promises whispered at an altar, and with the silent, patient hope for a child who will one day unite two worlds. And as these family trees grew more powerful, they also grew more intricate, until the branches began to tangle and intertwine in ways that would test the very limits of their design. But a family tree can become a tangled thicket where every branch claims the right to rule. For every dynasty that soared on the wings of a perfect marriage, another was torn apart by the very same logic. The Shadow Empire's foundation in bloodlines was not just a source of strength, it was also its most profound vulnerability. When the rules of inheritance grew murky, when too many descendants held a plausible claim, the delicate web of kinship could snap, plunging a kingdom into chaos. No story illustrates this danger more vividly than the long, brutal conflict known as the Wars of the Roses in England. This was not a war against a foreign invader. It was a civil war, a family feud fought on a national scale, and its roots stretched back generations to the prolific King Edward III. His many sons and their own numerous children created a sprawling network of royal cousins, each with a legitimate share of the royal blood. The crown was meant to pass in a clear line, but Edward's many marriages and their offspring created not one clear path, but a fork in the road. Two main branches descended from him, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and over time, both could argue they were the rightful heirs. The family tree, that sacred map of dynastic power, had become a confusing legal document open for dispute. This was the inherent risk of the marital strategy. Each new union, designed to extend influence, also sowed new seeds of future claimants. For decades, an uneasy peace held, but it was shattered by a marriage that was meant to secure the realm, not fracture it. The reigning King Henry VI, a Lancaster, was a gentle and scholarly man, ill-suited to the fierce politics of his time. To bolster his rule, his advisors arranged his marriage to Margaret of Anjou, a French princess of formidable will and political ambition. The goal was a powerful alliance with France, a classic move from the Shadow Empire playbook. But instead of bringing stability, this union acted like a lightning rod. Margaret's forceful nature and her favoritism toward her own circle inflamed the existing resentment among the rival Yorkist faction. She was seen not as a unifying queen, but as a foreign meddler, her marriage a symbol of a weak king and a court that had lost its way. The marital strategy had backfired spectacularly. What was designed as a bond of peace became a catalyst for war. For over 3 decades, the conflict raged, with the crown passing violently back and forth between the Lancastrian and Yorkist lines. Battlefields like Towton and Bosworth became the grim alternative to the marriage chapel. This period demonstrates the double-edged sword of building power through blood. The same system that could seamlessly unite empires through a single heir could also, with a few contested births or unclear wills, turn a kingdom against itself. The Wars of the Roses stand as history's starkest warning. A shadow empire built on marriages requires impeccable record-keeping and a great deal of luck. When the lineage becomes a labyrinth, the result is not a quiet inheritance but a deafening clash of steel, where the only thing being negotiated is survival. Behind every political alliance was a ledger. The pageantry of a royal wedding, with its silks and feasts, was merely the public celebration of a colossal financial transaction, one that could redirect the wealth of nations. To understand the Shadow Empire, you must look past the vows and into the vaults, because the flow of capital was the lifeblood of these unions. The most immediate and tangible element was the dowry. This was not a simple trousseau of personal belongings. It was a staggering transfer of wealth paid by the bride's family to the groom. A dowry could consist of chests of gold coin, annual revenues from specific estates, rights to profitable ports, or even entire towns and their surrounding land. It was the upfront cost of securing a powerful ally, a direct infusion of cash and assets meant to make the marriage irresistible to the groom's family. In 1503, when Margaret Tudor, sister of England's King Henry VII, married James IV of Scotland, her dowry was a masterstroke of economic statecraft. England paid a huge sum, effectively buying a period of peace on its volatile northern border. That English gold flowed directly into the Scottish royal treasury, funding James's ambitions and temporarily binding his interests to London's. For a time, the economic incentive for peace outweighed any old grudges, but the financial negotiation was a two-way street. In return for the dowry, the groom's family guaranteed the bride's future security through a jointure. This was an estate, a package of lands and incomes legally settled upon the bride to support her if she were widowed. The jointure was her economic insurance policy, ensuring she would not be left destitute and dependent on the charity of her in-laws. It was a critical part of the contract, a recognition that while the bride was a political asset, she was also a person who needed to be provided for. Together, the dowry and jointure created a powerful economic circuit. Wealth and property moved across borders, tying kingdoms together with bonds of debt and obligation as strong as those of blood. A king receiving a large dowry could use it to pay his soldiers, build a new palace, or patronize the arts, boosting his prestige and power. A princess with a substantial jointure held independent influence, capable of maintaining her own household and even funding political factions. These transfers could stabilize a shaky economy or, if mismanaged, plunge a realm into debt. The marriage market, therefore, was also a capital market. Dynastic advisors had to be as skilled in finance as they were in genealogy. Calculating the long-term yield on a marital investment. Was a province's annual revenue worth more than a one-time payment of silver? Could a strategic port generate enough trade to justify a smaller dowry? Every match was a complex equation balancing political gain against economic cost. This relentless flow of capital wove an economic web that perfectly supported the political one. Gold greased the wheels of diplomacy, made alliances stick, and turned royal children into the most valuable commodities in Europe. The treasury, not just the throne, was a silent partner in every negotiation, reminding us that the architecture of the Shadow Empire was built with stone and blood but funded by gold. A wedding vow could carry the quiet weight of a new god. While the Shadow Empire moved armies and gold through marital channels, its most profound exports were often invisible: ideas, beliefs, and an entire way of seeing the world. A princess arriving at a foreign court did not travel alone. In her retinue came scholars and architects, priests bearing sacred texts, and artisans trained in a distant capital style. She was a living bridge for culture, and her marriage could become the most elegant vehicle for conversion a dynasty ever devised. In the 8th century, a Byzantine princess named Theodora was given in marriage to Turval, the powerful Khan of Bulgaria. Her arrival was a diplomatic triumph for Constantinople, but her lasting impact was spiritual. Theodora, a devout Christian, brought her faith into the heart of a pagan steppe power. Her presence and influence are noted by historians as a pivotal force that accelerated the Christianization of the Bulgarian elite, weaving Byzantine religious and cultural threads directly into the fabric of their society. This was not a conquest by the sword, but a transformation by the hearth. The most dramatic example of this principle reshaped the map of faith itself. In the late 10th century, Prince Vladimir of Kievan Rus, a realm of Slavic tribes and Viking traders, sought a new religion to unify his people. After surveying the options, he chose Orthodox Christianity, and his conversion was sealed with a marriage alliance of staggering prestige. He married Anna Porphyrogenita, a daughter of the Byzantine emperor, a title meaning born in the purple and reserved for children born to a reigning sovereign. This was an unprecedented honor for a northern ruler. In return for this supreme marital prize, Vladimir accepted baptism, ordered the mass conversion of his people in the Dnieper River, and aligned his burgeoning realm permanently with the spiritual and cultural orbit of Constantinople. The priests, icons, and liturgical traditions Anna brought with her did not just change a court ritual. They redirected the spiritual destiny of millions for centuries to come, making Kiev a new center of Orthodox civilization. This was the Shadow Empire's ideological wing. A strategically placed bride could act as a permanent ambassador for her homeland's worldview, normalizing new customs, introducing new art, and legitimizing a new faith from within the very household of power. It was a form of soft power so subtle and pervasive that resistance often melted away, not through fear, but through gradual familiarity and the authority of the royal family itself. The goal was to make the foreign feel familial, to ensure that the next generation would inherit not just land, but a shared creed. This reveals the ultimate ambition of dynastic politics. It was never solely about controlling territory, but about shaping the very consciousness of that territory, crafting loyalties that were woven into the soul. The glittering web of dynastic power was spun from the lives of young women. For every treaty signed and border secured through marriage, there was a person, often a teenage girl, leaving her home forever to become a stranger in a foreign court. Their experiences reveal the true texture of the Shadow Empire, a fabric woven from threads of dazzling agency and deep resignation. Some of these women transcended their role as mere political conduits to become architects in their own right. Elena of Aquitaine stands as the most formidable example. When she married King Louis VII of France, she brought with her the vast, wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, a territory larger than the royal French lands themselves. But Elena was no passive asset. She accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, her presence and opinions shaping the campaign's course. When that marriage was annulled, she swiftly married the young and ambitious Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King Henry II of England. Through this union, she helped create the sprawling Angevin Empire. Even as Queen Consort and later, during a long imprisonment after rebelling against Henry, Elena never ceased to be a political force, governing territories, patronizing the arts of the troubadours, and expertly maneuvering to secure the throne for her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. Her life was a masterclass in using the limited tools available to a royal woman to build a legacy of tangible power. Yet for every Elena, there were countless others whose stories were written by obligation, not ambition. Consider Mary Tudor, the beautiful younger sister of England's King Henry VIII. Her fate was a stark transaction. To secure a fleeting peace with France, the 18-year-old princess was given in marriage to the 52-year-old King Louis XII, a man described as frail and gout-ridden. Contemporary accounts suggest Mary was deeply unhappy with the match, but her personal feelings were irrelevant to the needs of state. She was the living price of an alliance. Her body and her potential to bear an heir were the commodities exchanged. Though Louis's death after just a few months freed Mary to marry for love, her initial experience underscores a chilling reality. The princess was a currency, her youth and health valued only for their political yield. This is the central paradox of their existence. A life of immense privilege built upon a foundation of profound powerlessness. They wore crowns of gold that could feel as heavy as iron. Their letters, when history has preserved them, often whisper of loneliness, of longing for homeland, of the strain of navigating hostile courts where they were both honored guest and permanent outsider. The Shadow Empire was built on a currency more personal than gold, the surrendered autonomy of individuals. So we must pause and reflect. Can any empire, any structure of power assembled so deliberately from human lives, ever truly be called bloodless? The battles were absent, the fields untrampled by armies, but a quieter kind of sacrifice was always present. Recognizing this human dimension does not diminish the strategic brilliance of the marital system, but it completes the picture, adding a layer of poignant complexity to our understanding of how the world was once ruled. It reminds us that the most elegant political designs are never abstract. They are lived, breathed, and often endured by the people caught within them. The marriage contract was the true heart of the alliance. While the public celebrated with feasts and tournaments in a quiet chamber, a scribe's quill was etching the precise terms of power onto parchment. These were the prenuptial agreements of the medieval world, documents of breathtaking legal complexity that treated kingdoms like corporate assets and princesses like the vessels through which those assets would flow. The Treaty of Ivry, signed in 1177, is a perfect example. It was not a peace treaty ending a war, but a contract preceding a marriage, that of the future King Philip II of France to Isabella, the young heiress of the County of Hainaut. Its clauses were not about love or loyalty, but about real estate and revenue. The treaty meticulously listed which specific castles, towns, and annual incomes from Isabella's lands would be transferred to the French crown upon the marriage. It was a binding deed of sale where the currency was a royal title. These contracts left nothing to chance. They detailed the military support each party owed the other, turning a family bond into a mutual defense pact. They spelled out succession rights with lawyerly precision, defining exactly which child would inherit which title, and what would happen if the union produced no children at all. Every possible contingency, from the death of a spouse to a rebellion in a transferred territory, was anticipated and provided for. Teams of the finest legal minds in Europe would scrutinize every line, knowing that a single ambiguous phrase could spark a war generations later. This legalistic framework reveals the cold, calculated nature of the enterprise. A royal marriage was, first and foremost, a corporate merger. The bride and groom were the living signatures on a deal that transferred capital, consolidated market share, and secured future holdings. Love, or even mutual affection, was an accidental bonus, a fortunate but entirely unnecessary byproduct for the merger's success. The contract itself was the ultimate source of security and power. It turned the ephemeral promise of a dynasty into an enforceable legal fact, proving that in the Shadow Empire, the most powerful weapon was not a sword but a clause. Even the most carefully drafted marriage contract could be rendered worthless by a single man in Rome. For the architects of the Shadow Empire, the complex rules of the Catholic Church were not a spiritual matter alone. They were a critical piece of the political landscape, a set of obstacles and opportunities that had to be managed with as much care as any army. Canon law, the legal code of the Church, placed strict prohibitions on marriages between close relatives. This created a profound tension for dynasties whose entire strategy was to concentrate power within a tight family network. Marrying a cousin, a niece, or even a closer relation was often the most direct way to keep a valuable duchy or a royal claim from slipping into rival hands. To do this legally and without scandal, a king needed more than a willing bride. He needed a special exception from the Pope himself, a document known as a papal dispensation. This was the Church's ultimate power over the marital chessboard, the authority to bend its own sacred rules for a price, whether that price was political support, a generous donation, or a strategic alliance. With a stroke of his pen, the Pope could legitimize a union that would otherwise be considered sinful, turning a potential dynastic dead end into a clear path forward. The pursuit of these dispensations became a routine, if expensive, part of royal diplomacy. Ambassadors would lobby in the Vatican's corridors, presenting arguments that framed a politically necessary marriage as a benefit to Christendom itself, a move that would ensure peace and stability. The Church, in turn, wielded this power to shape the political order of Europe, rewarding loyal monarchs and punishing troublesome ones by granting or withholding this crucial permission. It was a delicate dance between sacred authority and secular ambition, where spiritual law and political necessity were constantly negotiated. This system worked smoothly for generations, until the moment it catastrophically did not. When King Henry VIII of England sought an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, to marry Anne Boleyn, he was not asking for a favor, he was demanding what he saw as his royal right. Catherine, however, was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful Catholic ruler in Europe. Pope Clement VII, under immense pressure and even direct military threat from Charles's forces, could not afford to grant the annulment. His refusal was not just a personal rebuke to Henry, it was the failure of a centuries-old system of negotiation between crown and papacy. Henry's response was to break that system entirely, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church in England and severing the nation from papal authority. The English Reformation, one of the most profound religious and political upheavals in European history, can be traced directly to a denied marital dispensation. It was the ultimate proof that the Shadow Empire did not exist in a secular vacuum. Its intricate architecture of power was built upon a foundation that included the very laws of God, as interpreted by his earthly representatives. To play the Game of Thrones, you had to also play the game of souls, understanding that the path to a crown sometimes led directly through the gates of Rome. The dance floor of European power was often a tense and crowded space, but few rivalries produced a more intricate marital ballet than that between England and France. For over a century, the Valois and Tudor dynasties circled each other, their every move a calculated step in a slow, dangerous waltz where marriage proposals were the primary language of diplomacy. This long, turbulent relationship offers a perfect case study in the Shadow Empire's practical realities, where not every gambit paid off, and the line between a brilliant alliance and a humiliating failure was razor-thin. It begins with a union that was less a marriage and more a declaration of victory. Following his stunning triumph at the Battle of Agincourt, England's warrior king Henry V demanded the hand of Catherine of Valois, daughter of the beleaguered French king. This was not a request for peace, but the final clause of a surrender document. Their marriage in 1420 was the ultimate political claim, a biological anchor meant to permanently tether the crown of France to the English royal line. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed to work. The Treaty of Troyes, which ratified the union, declared that Henry and Catherine's future son would be king of both England and France, stitching the two ancient enemies into a single realm through nothing more than a shared bloodline. Yet the Shadow Empire's plans are always at the mercy of fate. Henry's own sudden death just 2 years later, and the eventual weakness of his infant son's reign, allowed the French to rally. That meticulously planned dynastic fusion dissolved, leaving only a ghost of a claim that would haunt English kings for generations. The dance continued, but the music had changed. Now the proposals became more subtle, probes for advantage rather than outright claims of conquest. A century later, a young Henry VIII, eager to cement his status among European monarchs, entered into elaborate, years-long negotiations to marry a French princess. The goal was to isolate his rival, the Holy Roman Emperor, and tilt the continental balance of power. Ambassadors shuttled between London and Paris, discussing dowries, titles, and the exact timing of the ceremony. Portraits were exchanged, and the political landscape seemed to shift with every new letter. But in the end, the talks collapsed. The mutual distrust between the courts was too deep, the calculations of risk too uncertain. Henry turned instead to a Spanish alliance, marrying Catherine of Aragon. This failed negotiation was itself a form of intelligence, revealing the limits of English influence and the high price France placed on its own royal blood. It was a lesson in the Shadow Empire's economics. Some alliances were simply too expensive to buy, yet the dance could not stop. Temporary peace still required a seal. This is where we see the marital gambit used as a short-term diplomatic stitch. The marriage of Henry's sister, Mary Tudor, to the aged King Louis XII of France in 1514 was precisely that, a temporary, calculated stitch in a perpetually fraying fabric. It purchased a few years of quiet on the continent, allowing England to tend to its own affairs. When Louis died shortly after, the stitch pulled loose and the old patterns of rivalry re-emerged. Perhaps the most ambitious attempt to permanently mend the fabric came with Mary, Queen of Scots. Sent to France as a child, she was raised to be its queen. Her marriage to the French Dauphin in 1558 was the Valois dynasty's masterstroke, a plan to absorb Scotland and thereby encircle England with a unified Franco-Scottish power. For a fleeting moment, it succeeded. Mary became Queen of France, but once again fate intervened. Her young husband's early death left her a widow in a foreign court, her position untenable. The great merger evaporated, and Mary returned to a Scotland she barely remembered, her French ties now a liability rather than an asset. This century-long saga reveals a crucial, often overlooked truth about the Shadow Empire. Its history is not just a record of spectacular successes like the Habsburgs, but also a long ledger of learned failures. Each collapsed negotiation, each short-lived union, taught the dynastic planners something new about the limits of their craft. They learned that a marriage following a military victory could create resentment as easily as control. They learned that some blood feuds were too old to be solved by a wedding. And they learned that even the most perfect biological merger could be undone by the simple, unpredictable tragedy of an early passing. The Shadow Empire was built through relentless experimentation, where every royal cradle was both a hope and a hypothesis, and every quiet diplomatic rejection could echo as loudly as a lost battle. The elegant machinery of inheritance had a hidden, biological flaw. For all its political brilliance, the strategy of consolidating power within a family created a dangerous paradox. The very bloodlines that carried royal claims also carried hidden genetic instructions, and when those lines were woven too tightly together, the result was not greater strength but a profound weakening. The pursuit of a pure dynastic legacy, unsullied by outside claims, could quietly engineer its own ruin. No family illustrates this tragic irony more starkly than the Habsburgs, particularly their Spanish branch. After generations of spectacular success through calculated marriages, they began to turn inward, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, in a desperate effort to keep their colossal inheritance from fragmenting. Each new union was a political masterstroke, locking away another title from rival houses. But biologically, it was a closing trap. The gene pool, that invisible reservoir of hereditary material, grew shallower and shallower with each generation. Consider the marriage of King Philip IV of Spain to his niece, Mariana of Austria, in 1649. On paper, it was a flawless move, keeping Austrian and Spanish Habsburg interests perfectly aligned. In reality, it was another twist in a tightening genetic knot. Their son, who would become Charles II of Spain, was the culmination of centuries of this practice. Historical accounts and modern genetic analysis suggest he suffered from a host of severe physical and developmental challenges. His health was fragile, his speech was difficult, and he was unable to produce an heir. His courtiers, witnessing his struggles, called him El Hechizado, the bewitched searching for a supernatural cause for the king's profound difficulties. The true cause, however, was not magic but mathematics. The careful calculus of dynasty had failed to account for the laws of heredity. Charles was less a king in the traditional sense and more a living symbol of a system pushed to its breaking point. His very body became the battlefield where political ambition and biological reality finally collided. And when he passed without a clear successor, the political consequence was immediate and catastrophic. The vast Spanish Empire, assembled piece by piece through marriage contracts over 2 centuries, now had no obvious heir from its founding dynasty. Every royal house in Europe that had ever intermarried with the Habsburgs suddenly had a legal claim to the spoils. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict that raged for over a decade. Nations that had been bound by ancient marital ties now drew swords against each other, fighting over the carcass of the empire those same marriages had built. The Shadow Empire, so carefully constructed through whispers and weddings, was dismantled by the roar of cannons. This is the ultimate, sobering lesson of the genealogical game. A strategy focused solely on blood can become blind to the blood itself. Power built on the human body must respect its biological limits. The Habsburg story does not end with a triumphant heir, but with a poignant question echoing through the silent halls of the Escorial. What is the true cost of a crown when the price is paid not in gold, but in the very vitality of the line meant to wear it? The The Shadow Empire could design thrones, but it could not design robust health. It could write contracts for the future, but it could not write the genetic code that would determine if that future had a tomorrow. In their quest to become a family above all others, they discovered that no family, no matter how royal, operates outside the fundamental rules of nature. The Shadow Empire's reach eventually stretched beyond the familiar coasts of Europe, finding new territory in the vast, uncharted waters of the Age of Discovery. As kingdoms raced to map the world and claim its riches, the marital strategy adapted to a new frontier, the ocean itself. Royal marriages were no longer just about unifying duchies or securing continental borders. They became instruments of colonial policy, carefully drafted to transfer not just land, but the very ports and sea lanes that controlled global trade. The dowry chests now held the keys to empires. A perfect illustration of this maritime shift arrived in 1662 with the marriage of Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, to King Charles II of England. This union was engineered to solve two pressing problems. England, freshly restored from its civil war, needed to reassert itself as a global power. Portugal, a fading giant struggling against Dutch competition in the East, needed a powerful ally. The solution was written in a marriage contract. Catherine's dowry was not merely gold or jewels. It included the strategic port of Tangier on the North African coast, a gateway to the Mediterranean, and the island of Bombay, a sleepy but potentially vital outpost on the western coast of India. With a single signature, England acquired forward bases for its navy and a direct foothold in the lucrative Indian Ocean trade network. No fleet had to be assembled, no fortress stormed. A wedding party in London quietly secured assets that would fuel British colonial ambition for centuries. Bombay, in time, would grow into the megacity of Mumbai, a testament to the long shadow cast by a dynastic deal. This was the Shadow Empire thinking in three dimensions, projecting power across oceans through the quiet mechanism of kinship. Earlier, the great Iberian powers had used the same logic to manage their own colossal discoveries. When Spain and Portugal divided the globe between them with the Treaty of Tordesillas, they created a theoretical line down a map, but practical management of such distant, competing claims required a more personal touch. Strategic marriages between the Spanish and Portuguese royal families served as a living, breathing mechanism to ease tensions and coordinate policy across two empires upon which the sun truly never set. These unions were attempts to create a familial understanding, a shared interest that might prevent colonial conflicts from sparking wars back in Europe. They show us that the architects of the Shadow Empire understood a fundamental truth. In an age where wealth sailed in on ships, controlling the harbor was more valuable than controlling the hinterland. A well-placed port, acquired through a dowry, could generate more revenue than an entire inland province conquered at great cost. The marriage strategy evolved from a tool for terrestrial consolidation into one for maritime expansion. It allowed a kingdom to leapfrog thousands of miles of dangerous sea, planting its flag in a foreign land with all the legitimacy of a royal wedding certificate. The chessboard was now a globe, and the most powerful pieces were no longer knights and castles, but the queens and princesses whose journeys could redirect the flow of spices, silver, and history itself. But the true power of a dynastic union was not confined to the private signing of a contract. It had to be performed, broadcast in a spectacle of such overwhelming magnificence that its legitimacy became an unquestioned public fact. A royal wedding was a masterclass in political theater, a carefully scripted production where every procession, every portrait, and every commemorative coin served a single purpose: to weave the new alliance into the very fabric of collective memory. This was the propaganda of union, and its stage was the entire kingdom. When Henry VII, the first Tudor king, married Elizabeth of York in 1486, the ceremony was about far more than two people. It was the closing act of the Wars of the Roses. The pageants commissioned for their celebrations did not merely entertain, they delivered a potent visual message. Symbols of the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were intertwined everywhere, creating a new hybrid emblem, the Tudor rose. This was not subtle. It was a direct, unforgettable declaration to every noble and commoner that the old divisions were healed, that the blood of the two warring houses now flowed together in peace through this new royal line. The marriage itself was the living proof of reconciliation, and the pageantry ensured no one could miss the point. Beyond the day's festivities, the work of legitimization continued in more permanent forms. Kings and queens commissioned artists to paint grand allegorical portraits. In these works, the royal couple might be depicted as classical gods bringing an age of peace, or seated together with symbols of their united lands resting harmoniously at their feet. Tapestries woven with scenes of the wedding hung in palace halls, telling the story of unity to every visiting diplomat. Even the currency in people's pockets carried the message. Commemorative coins minted for the occasion showed the profiles of the king and queen facing each other, or their combined coats of arms, a daily reminder in the marketplace of the new political order. This orchestrated campaign of imagery served a critical, practical function. A marriage alliance was only as strong as the perception of its strength. If rival nobles or foreign courts saw the union as unstable, weak, or ill-fated, they might be tempted to challenge it, to support a different claimant or stir up old grievances. The lavish ceremony and its artistic echo were a preemptive strike against such doubts. They projected an image of divine favor, unshakable stability, and inevitable destiny. The wedding was a live broadcast of dynastic power, designed to reassure anxious subjects and deter ambitious rivals by making the new reality seem glorious, natural, and eternal. In this way, the soft power of perception became a hard currency of rule. The Shadow Empire understood that to control a kingdom, you first had to control its imagination. Yet even the strongest family ties could snap under the weight of a crown. For all their elegant promises, marital alliances were not magic spells of permanent loyalty. They created complex webs of obligation, but those webs could be torn apart by the sharper edges of territorial ambition and raw political interest. The history of the Shadow Empire is also a chronicle of its failures, moments when brother-in-law turned against brother-in-law, proving that shared blood was a conditional bond, not an absolute one. Consider the long, simmering conflict between England and France in the early 14th century. King Edward II of England was, through a series of strategic marriages, the brother-in-law to all three sons of King Philip IV of France. Their sisters were his queens. This should have been the ultimate familial peace, a network of kinship so dense it would make war unthinkable. And yet, for decades, they fought bitterly over the Duchy of Aquitaine, that rich slice of southwestern France held by the English crown. The familial connection did not soften the dispute, it merely complicated it, adding layers of personal betrayal to a geopolitical struggle. Letters between the courts were filled with the formal language of feudal law and the cold fury of familial disappointment. The French kings, as overlords, demanded Edward pay homage for Aquitaine. Edward, as a sovereign king in his own right, resisted what he saw as a humiliation. Their shared family dinners, real or metaphorical, did nothing to resolve the core issue: who truly controlled the land and its wealth. The marital bond created an expectation of loyalty, but it could not erase the older, more powerful drivers of national interest and dynastic pride. This pattern reveals the fundamental limit of the Shadow Empire's architecture. A marriage treaty was a tool of statecraft, a brilliant and often effective one, but it was not a substitute for power. Its strength depended entirely on a continuing balance of interests. If the benefits of maintaining the alliance were outweighed by the potential gains of breaking it, the familial connection often became the first casualty. The obligation was real, but it was negotiable. Furthermore, the success of any alliance ultimately rested on the unpredictable element of human personality. A marriage could link two realms, but it could not guarantee that the individuals wearing the crowns would be reasonable, trustworthy, or even competent. A stubborn, ambitious, or insecure ruler could easily interpret a treaty's terms in his own favor, viewing his in-law not as family, but as a rival who happened to be related. The web was woven by diplomats, but it was lived in by people with all their flaws, egos, and competing advisors. So these moments of betrayal are not mere historical footnotes. They are essential corrections to our understanding. They remind us that the Shadow Empire was a system built by humans for humans and was therefore perpetually vulnerable to human nature. The threads of loyalty, spun from gold and blood, could always be frayed by the relentless friction of ambition. Even as the dynastic machinery turned with relentless precision, a new wind began to stir across Europe. The Renaissance was not merely a rebirth of art and learning, it carried with it a revolutionary question about the human heart. What was the purpose of marriage? For centuries, the answer had been clear: a political and economic contract. But humanist scholars, inspired by rediscovered classical texts, began to champion a different ideal. They wrote of marriage as a partnership of minds, a union based on mutual affection, companionship, and even love. This intellectual shift introduced a profound tension into the courts of power, pitting soaring new ideals against entrenched old practices. The great thinker Erasmus, in his writings, openly criticized the system that treated royal children as mere commodities for trade, arguing it was both morally corrupt and practically foolish to chain two strangers together for life. Yet for all this beautiful rhetoric, the cold calculus of state rarely changed. The map of Europe was still a chessboard, and kings still needed their pawns. This period stands as a fascinating transitional phase, where the language around royal unions began to soften, even if the underlying strategic imperatives remained as hard as ever. We see this duality perfectly embodied in one of history's most famous power couples, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their marriage in 1469 was a masterstroke of political engineering, uniting two powerful Spanish kingdoms to finally expel Moorish rule from the peninsula. It was the ultimate strategic merger, yet chroniclers of the time also took special note of something unusual: a genuine partnership. They ruled together, consulted one another on matters of state, and presented a united front. While it would be a romantic exaggeration to call theirs a love match by modern standards, their relationship demonstrated a respect and collaboration that went far beyond a simple contractual obligation. It suggested that a political marriage could perhaps also be a functional and even affectionate one. This hints at the subtle shift the Renaissance prompted. The ideal was no longer just a profitable alliance, but an alliance that could also be harmonious. The rhetoric had changed, raising expectations and introducing a new layer of complication for royal matchmakers. They now had to consider not just lands and titles, but also temperaments, to avoid a publicly disastrous and unhappy union that humanist writers could scorn. So when, if ever, did love enter the equation for those born to rule? For the vast majority, it remained a distant luxury. Personal choice was a risk that kingdoms could seldom afford. Yet, the very fact that thinkers were now advocating for it, that chroniclers noted its absence or presence, marked a quiet revolution. It meant that the architects of the Shadow Empire now had to at least pay lip service to the human within the prince or princess. The machinery still turned, but a new voice was in the room, whispering that there might be more to power than pure calculation, and more to a crown than the weight of its gold. The most valuable intelligence in a royal court was often whispered over embroidery. A royal consort arrived at her new kingdom as the centerpiece of a diplomatic transaction, but she was never truly alone. Surrounding her was an entire imported household, a miniature court transplanted from her homeland. This entourage of ladies-in-waiting, confessors, physicians, and secretaries was far more than a comfort for a homesick young woman. It was a living, breathing extension of her native kingdom's interests, a political network that took up residence in the very heart of power. The royal bedchamber, therefore, became one of the most subtle and significant frontiers in the endless information war between states. These attendants were the consort's eyes and ears, but they could also become her voice, and through her, the voice of a foreign power influencing policy from within. Managing this court within a court was a perpetual, delicate dance for the host kingdom, a constant calculation of how much foreign influence was the acceptable price for a strategic alliance. It meant that a marriage treaty effectively granted diplomatic immunity to a small army of potential spies, all operating under the sacred cover of the Queen's domestic privacy. The potential of this imported network is brilliantly illustrated by Catherine de' Medici, the Italian noblewoman who became Queen of France in the 16th century. Her court was famously filled with Florentine advisors, artists, and confidants. When France was torn apart by the brutal wars of religion, a conflict between Catholics and Protestants that brought immense hardship, Catherine's Italian circle became her trusted cabinet. They provided counsel, managed correspondence, and helped her navigate the deadly politics of a fractured realm. From their perspective, they were loyal servants ensuring the Queen's safety and effectiveness. To many French nobles, however, they were a suspicious cabal, outsiders whispering foreign ideas into the monarch's ear and manipulating the kingdom's destiny. This inherent tension was unavoidable. A consort's household was a fortress of familiarity in a foreign land, but it could also be seen as an occupying force of influence. The ladies-in-waiting, often chosen from her own country's nobility, were not just companions. They were the primary channels for confidential letters back home, the collectors of court gossip that could reveal a rival's weakness or a faction's plot. A priest from her homeland could provide spiritual solace, but his confessional might also gather sensitive information under the seal of secrecy, information that could be useful to his native king. This created a pervasive atmosphere of mutual suspicion. The host king's advisors would watch the foreign entourage closely, trying to distinguish between innocent service and espionage. They might plant their own agents within the household or intercept letters. The consort herself lived in a double bind, expected to be loyal to her husband and adopted country, yet perpetually surrounded by reminders of, and sometimes direct pressure from, the land of her birth. Her most private quarters were, in effect, a diplomatic listening post. This reality forces us to expand our view of the Shadow Empire once more. It was not just a web of treaties and bloodlines. It was a living system of human networks, of trusted faces and whispered conversations that operated in the dimly lit corridors behind the throne. Every strategic marriage, therefore, carried a hidden operational cost, the permanent stationing of a subtle, sanctioned intelligence operation within the palace walls. The success of the alliance could hinge on whether that embedded network became a bridge of understanding or a nest of distrust, proving that in the game of dynastic power, the softest voices in the quietest rooms could sometimes shake the foundations of kingdoms. A shadow empire reveals its true architecture not in the calm of a stable reign, but in the chaos of its sudden end. The ultimate test of any dynastic web came when the main line of a royal family simply stopped, when a king died without a clear heir. In that terrifying vacuum of power, the silent, patient work of generations of marital strategists suddenly roared to life. All those carefully recorded genealogies, those long-forgotten marriage contracts signed a century earlier, became the most valuable documents in the world. Rival courts would scramble not to mobilize armies but to produce elaborate family trees, tracing a fragile thread of kinship back to a great-great aunt who had married a foreign prince. This was the moment when dormant claims, planted like seeds in distant soil, could burst into full bloom, allowing one dynasty to peacefully absorb another's crown through nothing more than a persuasive legal argument. The extinction of a line was not a catastrophe for the Shadow Empire, it was the harvest. Consider the staggering vacancy that opened in 1572. The mighty Jagiellon dynasty, which had ruled the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for nearly 2 centuries, found itself without a single male heir. The main line had ended. This was not a minor political upset. It was an existential crisis for one of Europe's largest and most powerful states. With no obvious successor, the Commonwealth's powerful nobles turned to an extraordinary solution. They would elect their next king. And who did they consider? Candidates whose primary qualification was a web of marital connections spun long ago. The first elected monarch was Henry of Valois, the brother of the King of France. His claim was tenuous, resting on the marriage of his grandfather to a Jagiellon princess. He ruled for less than a year before fleeing back to France to claim a different throne, but his brief election proved the principle. The nobles then turned to Stephen Bathory, a Hungarian prince with his own marital links, before finally settling on Sigismund Roman III Vasa, the heir to the Swedish crown. Sigismund's mother was Catherine Jagiellon, a sister of the last king. That single fraternal bond that sister sent to marry the King of Sweden a generation earlier was the thin, golden thread that now pulled the entire Commonwealth into the Swedish sphere of influence. A marriage made for one era's alliance had decades later decided the fate of a nation. These succession crises were the grand tournaments of genealogy. When a throne sat empty, ambassadors would arrive bearing not threats but elaborate parchment scrolls. These were not simple lists of names, they were works of art and legal persuasion, visually mapping out a claimant's descent through a labyrinth of intermarriages. A single dotted line connecting a great-grandmother to a foreign prince could be presented as an irrefutable divine right. The goal was to demonstrate that your candidate was not a foreign usurper, but a long-lost cousin, the closest living relative with a legitimate, blood-born claim. This process transformed history into a weapon. A marriage that had been a minor footnote in the chronicles of a prior reign suddenly became the central pillar of a new political reality. The Shadow Empire's legacy was precisely this, its ability to have its candidates ready and waiting in the wings when opportunity struck. It meant that a national tragedy for one realm could become a dynastic windfall for another, all without a declaration of war. The peaceful inheritance of a crown through a centuries-old marital link was the highest achievement of this form of statecraft, proving that the most enduring conquests were often those recorded in parish registries and family Bibles, not on battlefield maps. It asks us a profound question about the nature of power itself. Is it more formidable to take a throne by force, or to have your family's name already written into its line of succession, waiting patiently for history to call? The quiet logic of the dynastic web depended on a single, unspoken premise, that all of Europe answered to one spiritual authority. That premise shattered in the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation did more than divide a church. It fractured the very board upon which the marital chess game was played. Suddenly, a king's choice of bride was no longer just a political calculation. It was a theological declaration, one that could ignite rebellion within his own borders or draw the furious condemnation of Rome. The elegant, flexible system of papal dispensations, which had once smoothed over even the closest of familial marriages, now meant nothing to a growing portion of the continent. A Catholic prince considering a Protestant princess now faced an impossible choice: risk the souls of his subjects and his own excommunication, or forfeit a potentially brilliant alliance. The calculus of power was now tangled with the salvation of souls, and the Shadow Empire had to navigate a landscape lit by the fires of heresy and zeal. The marriage of England's Catholic Queen Mary I to the future King Philip II of Spain in 1554 stands as a stark monument to this new tension. To Mary, it was a perfect dynastic move, reuniting England with the powerful Spanish Habsburgs and the Catholic fold. To many of her English subjects, however, it was a terrifying prospect. They saw not an alliance but a submission, fearing the Spanish king would drag England into endless European wars, and worse, use the marriage as a tool to crush the growing Protestant faith in their homeland. The union became a lightning rod for a potent new force, religious nationalism. It was no longer just about foreign influence, it was about a foreign faith. The public outcry was so severe it sparked a rebellion, proving that a population's religious identity could now outweigh their loyalty to a crown's marital strategy. The old tools of control were sparking against new, ideological flint. Yet, within this division, new patterns of power began to form. If Catholic monarchs were now largely bound to marry within their own confession, Protestant rulers faced the same constraint, but also a new opportunity. A series of strategic marriages between Lutheran and Calvinist princely houses in the German states began to weave a distinct Protestant bloc, a counter-network of kinship and mutual support aimed at balancing the overwhelming might of the Catholic Habsburgs. These unions were defensive alliances written in family terms, creating a web of solidarity that could provide military aid, political refuge, and a shared sense of destiny against a common ideological enemy. The Shadow Empire was no longer a single, continent-spanning design. It was splitting into competing architectures of faith. This forced a profound recalculation in every royal chancellery. The pool of acceptable marital partners for any given ruler suddenly shrank by half. A dynastic planner could no longer simply scan the horizon for the richest heiress or the most strategic claim. They first had to ask, what does she believe? And what will my people believe about me if I bring her here? The Reformation transformed royal marriage from a primarily geopolitical instrument into a core instrument of domestic religious policy. A king's wedding could now either cement his authority by affirming his subjects' faith, or undermine it by appearing to betray that faith for foreign gain. The elegant, patient game of genealogical chess had encountered a player it could not control, the individual conscience amplified to the scale of nations. It revealed that the most resilient shadow empires are those built on shared belief, and that when those beliefs diverge, even the strongest bonds of blood can be strained to breaking. The most durable conquests are not always made of land. When a princess crossed a border to marry, she carried with her an entire world of taste, tradition, and law, a cultural dowry that could reshape the identity of her new kingdom for centuries. The Shadow Empire's true endurance is found not in faded treaties, but in the living stone of cathedrals, the rhythms of a changed language, and the very principles by which people sought justice. These unions were channels for a quiet, profound kind of inheritance, one that often outlived the dynasties that arranged them. Consider Elena of Castile, who arrived in England as the queen of King Edward I in the 13th century. She did not just bring a Spanish alliance, she brought a distinct sensibility. Historians note her influence on the design of several royal castles and palaces, introducing elements of Iberian and Mediterranean architecture to the English landscape. A decorative archway, a new layout for a garden, a preference for lighter, more elegant spaces. These subtle shifts in stone and mortar began to weave a thread of continental style into the fabric of British design, a visual reminder of the kingdom's expanding horizons. But the cultural transfer could be far more foundational, reshaping the very bedrock of society. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is remembered as a brutal military invasion, but William the Conqueror's claim to the English throne was itself rooted in a distant marital link. his assertion that he was the rightful heir through his great-aunt. His victory did more than install a new king. It forced a monumental fusion of legal systems. The existing traditions of Anglo-Saxon law, with its local courts and communal judgments, collided with the more centralized feudal legal customs brought by the Normans. From this clash, a new hybrid system slowly emerged, one that would eventually evolve into the common law tradition that underpins legal systems across the English-speaking world today. The marriage claim provided the pretext for the conquest, and the conquest forced a lasting marriage of laws. Language itself could be transformed by these alliances. For centuries after the Norman conquest, French was the language of the English royal court, of law, and of high culture. Official documents, court proceedings, and the conversations of the nobility flowed in French, while Old English persisted among the common people. This linguistic divide created a layered society where words for governance like parliament, justice, and sovereign came from French, while words for basic labor like sheep, cow, and earth remained Anglo-Saxon. The shadow of that dynastic union, that imported court, echoed in the very vocabulary of power. So when we look at a Gothic cathedral spire reaching for the sky in England, or trace the origins of a legal principle, or simply use a word like liberty, we are encountering the long-term cultural legacy of those strategic vows. The political alliances brokered in candlelit chambers eventually dissolved, but the art, architecture, and legal frameworks they set in motion became permanent threads in the tapestry of a nation. The shadow empire built with marriages did not just redirect armies and gold, it quietly redirected the course of civilization itself, proving that the softest power, the power of ideas, aesthetics, and language, is often the one that endures long after the crowns have turned to dust. The principles of the shadow empire never truly vanished. They simply changed their wardrobe, trading royal velvet for corporate suits and political handshakes. The age of forging alliances through matrimony may have receded, but the underlying logic of merging power through strategic connection is more alive than ever. We see it in the quiet boardrooms of global finance. A modern corporate merger is, in essence, a dynastic union without the wedding bells. When two massive companies choose to combine, they are executing a bloodless takeover, weaving together their assets, their market reach, and their future revenue streams into a single, more formidable entity. They avoid the costly chaos of a hostile takeover, the corporate equivalent of a siege, in favor of a negotiated alliance that promises mutual benefit and expanded dominion. The language of these deals echoes the old marriage treaties, discussing synergies instead of succession, market share instead of duchies, and shareholder value instead of royal blood. The goal remains identical: to build a network of influence so vast and interconnected that it commands its own landscape, whether that landscape is made of medieval fiefdoms or digital marketplaces. This dynastic thinking also persists within the corridors of political power in many nations today. While the mechanisms are democratic, the enduring influence of certain families reveals how name recognition and cultivated networks can function as a kind of inherited political capital. In various parts of the world, from the Americas to Asia, political dynasties continue to shape leadership, where a famous surname provides a foundation of trust, a ready-made network of allies, and a narrative of legacy that voters find compelling. These modern political houses may not secure power through royal marriage, but they understand the ancient art of leveraging family as a vehicle for soft power, building loyalty and maintaining influence across generations. It is a reminder that the human instinct to trust and follow familiar lineages is a force that transcends the specific institution of monarchy. The most profound echo, however, is in the relentless human pursuit of legacy. The medieval king sought to secure his dynasty's future through a strategic marital web. Today's tycoon or founder seeks to build a family office or a philanthropic foundation designed to perpetuate influence and values long after they are gone. The tools are different, trusts and endowments instead of marriage contracts, but the impulse is the same, to create a structure that extends one's vision and control beyond a single lifetime, weaving a lasting shadow of influence. This connection transforms our view of history. The shadow empire of the Habsburgs or the Tudors is not a bizarre artifact. It is the prototype, the original blueprint for how humans build enduring power through alliance, kinship, and far-sighted planning. The chessboard has globalized and the pieces have new names, but the game of connecting, merging, and legacy building continues with a familiar, patient rhythm. It suggests that while crowns may fade, the architecture of influence is built from timeless human materials, ambition, connection, and the deep desire to shape a tomorrow that still bears your name. The intricate family tree that had conquered Europe finally reached its last barren branch with Charles II of Spain. His passing without an heir in 1700 did not just mark the end of a king's life, it triggered the collapse of the grandest dynastic design in history. The War of the Spanish Succession was the Shadow Empire's violent reckoning, a continent-wide conflict ignited because the meticulous marital strategy had produced a ruler who could not, in the most fundamental biological sense, continue his own line. For over a decade, nations that had been woven together by generations of Habsburg marriages now tore at the fabric, each supporting a different claimant descended from some long-ago union. The peace treaties that finally ended the fighting, like that of Utrecht in 1713, did more than assign a winner. They performed a careful autopsy on the Spanish Habsburg inheritance, dissecting the unified empire and distributing its organs, its Italian territories, its Flemish provinces, to various royal houses across Europe. The monumental structure built through 100 quiet weddings was dismantled by a single, thunderous war. The Austrian branch of the family endured, still ruling from Vienna, but their situation revealed the strategy's ultimate limitation. To maintain control over their remaining patchwork of kingdoms and duchies, they could no longer rely solely on the fading magic of shared royal blood. The 19th century brought rising tides of nationalism, where a Czech peasant or a Hungarian noble began to identify more strongly with their language and land than with a distant, German-speaking emperor who happened to be a distant cousin. In response, the Habsburgs were forced to evolve. They built a vast, impersonal bureaucracy, a maze of administrative offices designed to govern by paperwork and protocol. They leaned ever more heavily on their standing army, using the threat of force to suppress the very separatist sentiments that their own marital network had once kept peacefully contained. This final act lays bare the core truth of the Shadow Empire. Marital politics were a brilliant tool for assembly, for quietly snapping together the pieces of a colossal dominion. But maintenance required something more enduring than genealogy. It required shared identity, functional institutions, and a common purpose that mere blood relations, stretched thin across 1,000 miles and a dozen cultures, could never permanently provide. The empire constructed through whispers at the altar ultimately could not withstand the roar of the modern world. The moral architecture of this shadow empire rests on a single, troubling trait. For the peace of millions, the autonomy of a few was quietly surrendered. This is the central, unresolved question that lingers long after the treaties have faded. Can a system that treats human beings as strategic commodities, as living treaties, ever be morally justified, even if it prevented some wars? On one side of the scale rests a powerful argument for stability. In a violent and fragmented world, a dynastic marriage could secure a border for a generation, sparing countless families the hardship of invasion, the loss of harvests, and the march of foreign soldiers through their fields. A single union might forge a lasting peace where decades of warfare had failed. The cold pragmatism of this calculus is undeniable. It viewed the individual as a necessary instrument for a greater collective good, a sacrifice on the altar of geopolitical order. Yet the other side of that scale holds a profound and personal cost. This system institutionalized the idea that a person's body, their future, and their capacity for love were not their own. They were assets of the state to be deployed for its benefit. While men in these arrangements certainly faced pressure and duty, the weight fell most heavily on young women. Their consent was often a legal formality, their personal hopes irrelevant to the negotiations that decided their fate. They were transplanted into foreign courts, expected to navigate complex politics in a new language, and to bear children who would cement an alliance they did not choose. Their lives became case studies in a specific kind of loneliness, a gilded isolation where every comfort could not mask the fact of their instrumental purpose. The brilliance of the strategy, then, is forever shadowed by its human reality. We can admire the diplomatic ingenuity that stitched continents together without overt conflict, while also recognizing that this peace was purchased with a particular kind of quiet suffering. This tension did not go unnoticed in their own time. In the early 16th century, the philosopher and statesman Thomas More penned his famous work Utopia, envisioning an ideal society. In it, he proposed a startlingly modern idea. He suggested that before a wedding, the prospective bride and groom should be presented to each other without their fine clothes, so their true selves could be seen and chosen. His vision placed mutual choice and clear-eyed consent at the very heart of the marital bond, a direct critique of the transactional system dominating the courts of Europe. More's ideal highlights the gap between the world as it was and the world as it could be, forcing us to reflect on the values embedded in our own histories. To study the Shadow Empire is therefore to engage in a constant moral reckoning. It asks us to hold two difficult truths in balance. We can acknowledge the strategic mastery that built empires from whispers, understanding the brutal context in which these choices were made. Simultaneously, we must listen for the silent stories within the grand narrative, the whispers of those who paid the price for that stability. It reminds us that history's most elegant political solutions are never bloodless in the full sense of the word. They may save blood from being spilled on battlefields, but they often demand a different sacrifice, drawn from the inner lives of those cast as pawns in a magnificent, relentless game. This reflection does not diminish the past, but deepens our understanding of it, revealing that the pursuit of power in any age is always a negotiation between collective ambition and individual dignity. From those quiet chapels and grand halls, a final truth emerges about power itself. It is not a singular force, but a spectrum. At one end lies the hard power of conquest, clear and brutal, written in the language of sieges and surrenders. At the other end lies the soft power of connection, subtle and enduring, written in the language of kinship and mutual interest. The Shadow Empire existed in that vast, fertile middle ground. It understood that true, lasting dominion required both the implied threat of the sword and the binding promise of the shared grandchild. The warrior could seize a throne, but only the diplomat could ensure it remained in the family for generations. This is why these stories still resonate. They are not quaint tales of archaic rituals, they are masterclasses in long-term strategy. They reveal a form of intelligence that looks beyond the immediate battle to the century-long campaign, where victory is measured not in territories occupied in a single lifetime, but in bloodlines secured for 10. As you scroll through news of modern political alliances or corporate mergers, pause for a moment. Look past the press conferences and the stock tickers. You might just glimpse the faint, elegant outline of an ancient pattern, the quiet, relentless work of building something meant to last, of weaving a web of influence so subtle it becomes the very air a society breathes. If this journey has reshaped your view of history, share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more journeys into the hidden mechanics of the past. And remember, sometimes the most powerful arrows are the ones never fired, but the bonds quietly forged.